Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Samach Daled. Today's daf is dedicated by Rona Fink in honor of Avigal Bat Miriam Baruch with blessing for Refuah Shlema, Refuat HaNefesh, or Refuat HaGuf. Okay, we're going to just quickly, I want to go back to one thing that I didn't spell out well enough yesterday that I saw after, which is there's a very important machloket Rashi and Tosfot on the Mishnah. The Mishnah was all about Hashochet et Pesach ala Chametz. Right? This is someone who slaughters the Korban Pesach with chametz, okay, which we said it's either at home or maybe in the asara where they are. Somebody has to own the chametz. It could be any one of various people, the shochet, the zorek. It could be the people in the chabura. Then we ended with Rav Papa, who says even the person who burns the imurim on the parts that get burnt on the altar, also he could be responsible. And it sounded like, and that's what Rashi says, Rashi in the very last line of Rashi on Samach Gimel Amud Aleph says, "V'im yesh le'echad mehem kulam ovrim." If any one of those people has chametz, everybody gets lashes, it sounds like, which is kind of extreme, right? One sin, everyone gets lashes if one person has it. So Tosfot disagrees. On the top of Samach Gimel Amud Bet, Tosfot says, "Omer ri de lo mechayev ba'al chametz." The person who has the chametz actually isn't the one responsible. Who's the one responsible? The shochet or the zorek. The person, now why are they different? Because they're the person that did the action. And he says, we just learned that Rabbi Yochanan holds, and this is the classic opinion, that alav she'ein bo ma'aseh, if you don't do an action associated with a negative commandment, then you don't get lashes. So he says, this is alav she'ein bo ma'aseh. If I have chametz in my house and I'm part of the group and someone else slaughters it, it's his responsibility, which is fascinating, right? That someone else can be responsible if I have chametz in my house. It's a huge responsibility on the person who slaughtered. And especially we're going to see today that the person who slaughtered was usually just one of the group as a representative. And they took on a lot of responsibility on themselves because then in the end, it was on him. Or if someone was zorek the blood, if he sprinkled the blood, or even as we said, like Rav Papa says, even someone who burns the parts on the altar, they're responsible to make sure that no one else has chametz with them. And that according to Tosfot, not everyone in the group gets lashes. According to Rashi, everyone in the group would also get lashes. It's a very big difference. Okay, we're going to start at the bottom. So we brought this Braita, where we ended yesterday, was we brought a Braita that held like Rav Papa. And there's two things in that Braita that we're now going to deal with. One is, it said that if you burn the imurim and people, right, remember, that's not one of the four main rituals of the sacrificing. But despite that, they still think you're going to be obligated. Haktara is treated like shchita here, the burning. And it also said that hamoleket ha'of, if you do malikat ha'of, which is again the way you would slaughter birds in the temple, you wouldn't slaughter them by shchita, you would do malika, which was the special thing the Kohen would take his thumb and at the back of the neck, he would basically slaughter the animal using his thumb. And that also, it says here, dafka not also, sorry, I should say it better. If you look a few lines from the bottom, it says, Hamolechet ha'of ba'arba'asar eino over below klum. If you do that on the 14th and someone has chametz, no problem, okay? You're not over on this lo ta'aseh lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi. That's only for, again, for what? The Korban Pesach and maybe the Korban Tamid, or we'll see. Remember, that was the machloket in the Mishnah. Just to review, we had Tanakama who said this isur. Okay, I want to point out two things about this isur. First of all, it says in the verse, "Lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi," right? The lo yalin. Let me just read it inside. Lo yalin laboker zevach chag Pesach. Notice Pesach is only mentioned at the end of the verse. Shmot lamed daled pasuk kafhe. You can't slaughter with chametz the blood of my sacrifice. It doesn't say what sacrifice, so that leads to the debate: is it the Korban Pesach? Is it Rabbi Yehuda, the Korban Pesach and the Tamid? Or according to Rabbi Shimon, it depends what day you're talking about. On Yud Daled, when you bring the Korban Pesach, it's only Korban Pesach. On the other days, it's going to be, on the rest of the holiday, it's going to be any sacrifice that was done properly, okay? Which means even if it was done improperly, but it still could be slaughtered like a shalol lishma in most cases, okay? If it can be properly brought as a sacrifice, then you're obligated. We'll get in more into where does Rabbi Yehuda come from? Where does Rabbi Shimon come from in the Gemara today? But what I want to also point out is, number one, it never said Chag Pesach there. It only said it in the latter part of the verse, which was talking about not leaving over the parts to burn on the altar. And what I also wanted to point out is that there's two verses in the Torah that talk about this. One is the one that we read, Shmot Lamed Daled, and the next verse, by the way, talks about all the verses surrounding it. You can look in the Torah, talk about the Chagim in general. Okay, it's not just Pesach, and they also talk about after, bring my bikurim to the land. Okay, bikurei ad matcha, tavi to the temple, right? Like Shavuot related. And then it says, Lo tavashel di b'chalev imo. Both, the next pasuk after this pasuk is about not cooking milk and meat. I'm not going to get into why, but it's the same section appears almost verbatim, the same words in both those sections. So the other reference of it, I want to just point out there's one minor difference. In Shmot Kaf Gimel Yud Chet, it says, Lo tizbach al chametz dam zivchi. Instead of lo tishchat, lo tizbach. And that's why you can see that it's not just the shochet, it's also someone who does a different element of the korban. Because tizbach is a more general word, even though tizbach also often means slaughter. But it says that. And the other difference is the lo yalin chelev chagi ad boker. In the verse I quoted before, it says, don't leave over the Chag Pesach. This says, don't leave over any of my holiday offerings. It's a much more general verse. So you could also see where they would get that maybe this verse isn't talking only about Pesach. So now we have a contradiction in the Breita. We're going to bring another Breita that's going to contradict the Breita that Rav Papa brought to support, that the Gemara brought to support Rav Papa in two ways. Urimini. Some of this is going to be identical. Okay, if you slaughter the animal when you have chametz in your possession or in someone's possession, we'll see who, you're over and a lo taseh, negative commandment. Rabbi Yehuda omer afa tamid, again, like our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says also the korban tamid. Amru lo amru ela b'Pesach bilvad. They said to him, what are you talking about? This pasuk is only talking about Chag Pesach. And they obviously used the last part of the verse in Shmot Lamed Daled where it says, Lo yalin laboker zeva Chag Pesach. Then we said, when is this? Again, who is it? Either the shochet has chametz, or the zorek, the person sprinkling the blood, or anyone in the group. If there's chametz right in front of you, but it belongs to somebody entirely, not having to do with anything, no problem. Here's problem number one. Whether you slaughter, whether you sprinkle the blood, or whether you do malika or haza'ah, which is the sprinkling of the blood from the bird offering. So here all of a sudden you see the bird offering is in. And we just said in the other Breita, it's not relevant for the bird offering. Say when you take the Kohen would take the kmitza from the meal offering and he would burn it on the altar. Clearly when you do the kmitza, that's the comparable act to shchita when it comes to the meal offering because there is no shchita. But that comparable act, yes, it's true, it's somewhat comparable to shchita, but it doesn't count here. This is only if you actually slaughter, and obviously a meal offering, you don't slaughter, it's not an animal, it's just flour and water. Hamaktira to imurim. Here's the next important line. When you burn the imurim, the person who does the burning, what did we just say in the Breita, is liable. What does it say here? Eino over below tase. Not liable. So the Gemara is going to point out that there's two contradictions between these Breitot. Kashya malika malika v'kashya haktara haktara. Right, one is malika is a problem. One said malika is not a problem. One said haktara is a problem. One said haktara isn't a problem. Notice it's crisscrossed. Right? The one that says malika is out says haktara is in, and the reverse in the second one. So they say, wait a minute. The litamech, here's the Gemara's response. According to what you're saying, tikshilach gufa, the second Breita contradicts itself. Why? Tikatane, it says there, lo amru ele b'Pesach bilvad. It says this negative prohibition is only relevant to Pesach. But then, it says, echad shochet, echad zorek, echad molek, echad mazeh. And then it says, but also if you do malika, malika is obviously not relevant to the korban pesach. You don't bring a korban pesach from a bird, and malika is only by birds. So it in of itself doesn't make any sense. So therefore, let's use that as our clue to figuring out the problem or what this Breita is actually referring to. And then we can see how it works in with the other Breita. Elaha Rabbi Shimon. Both Breitot must be Rabbi Shimon. Malika amalika lo kashya. So first we'll deal with the problem with malika. Kam ba'arba'asal, kam b'cholosha moed. Remember Rabbi Shimon, what did he say? If you're standing on the 14th, the only one that's relevant for this prohibition is the korban pesach. When you're during the rest of the holiday, it could be anything, right? Any korban that's brought properly, you'd be obligated if you'd be liable if you had chametz in your possession. So he says, and if you look at the words of the Braita that we brought for Rav Papa, the first one, it says, "Hamolechet ta'of ba'ar ba'asar eino over below klum." So there you have it, even explicitly. It says on the 14th, which means on the 14th you're not obligated, but you are going to be liable if you do melikat ha'of during the Chag Pesach, during the rest of the holiday, let's say on the 17th of Nisan, and you have chametz in your house. Okay, so that's how we resolve the first contradiction. Haktara namilok v'idi Rabbi Shimon, right? And they both go by Rabbi Shimon's opinion, who was the one who made that distinction between the 14th and the rest of the days. Haktara namilok kasha. Also, the burning the fats and those parts on the altar also is not a contradiction. Why? Tanahi, there's a machloket tanaim. They're both according to Rabbi Shimon, but they're within Rabbi Shimon. There's a debate about whether de'ika de makish haktara l'shchita ve'ika man de lo makish. There are some who say that haktara is compared to shchita, that burning of the parts is kind of like treated like shchita, and therefore, if the shochet is going to be responsible, also the one who burns. And the other one holds it's not. So we have this two opinions, and that's how we resolve the contradiction. In the end, as long as you can say there's two different opinions here, then it no longer contradicts. That's the way we treat it when we have two Tanaitic sources, right? Then we can say they're equal. When you have a Braita, let's say a Tanaitic source against an Emora, then it's more complicated to say that unless you can try to find that there's some Tanaitic debate, and then you can say the Emora is holding by one side and the Braita is holding by another. But it's easier when you have two Tanaitic sources. You could just say these are two different traditions. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Afa Tamid. So my Tamid de Rabbi Yehuda, where does he get it from? That even the Korban Tamid is part of this. Amar lach zivchi. It says, Lo tishchata chametz dam zivchi. How does he understand zivchi? Zevach hamiyuchadli. It's the one that's unique to me. What's unique to me? Umay nihu tamid. The tamid is special. We talked about this the other day, right? Even though you would think the one that's done once a year is special, but there's something special about what you do every single day. So because of that, he says that's the special one, and therefore that's included in the verse under zivchi. Rabbi Shimon Omer, haPesach ba'ar ba'asar. So now, where does Rabbi Shimon get off making this complicated distinction between on the 14th, it's just the Pesach. On the other days, and then he got a little bit complicated. I'll read it, the words inside. He says, if you look back at the Mishnah on Samach Gimel, haPesach ba'ar ba'asar, again, he gets into the lishmo and shalo lishmo. If you do it lishmo, l'shem Pesach, you take what you designated for a Pesach and you slaughter it for a korban Pesach on the 14th, and you have chametz in your house, you're liable. Shalo lishmo, but if you remember, if you take it on the 14th and you do it for the wrong korban, you say, I'm sacrificing this as a shlamim, even though you had already designated as a Pesach, it's not a valid offering. If it's not a valid offering and you haven't have chametz at home, we don't really care because you didn't really, it wasn't a sacrifice. So that's the first part. Then he says, Ushar kol hazvachim, if it's any other sacrifice on the 14th, it doesn't matter whether it was sacrificed properly or improperly, bein lishmam, bein shalo lishmam patur. That's not part, right? The 14th, it's only the Pesach. Uba moed, and when you're talking about during the holiday, lishmo patur shalo lishmo chayav. If you take a Pesach and you do it for the sake of Pesach, you take an animal, you designate it for Pesach, but you didn't sacrifice it on your Dalit on the 14th. And instead, you pushed it off, right? You didn't deal with it. What did we learn? It automatically becomes a shlemim. So he says, if you do it lishmo, l'shem Pesach, there is no such thing as bringing a Pesach on the 17th. So you're exempt from lo tishchata chametz dam zivchi, because that's not a real sacrifice. If you do it shelo lishmo, but you say, I'm doing this for a shlemim, you're going to be obligated. You're going to be obligated because that you can do. It's a valid offering, and you're doing it during the holiday, and you have chametz at home. It's a problem. And all the others, zvachim, bein lishmam, bein shelo lishmam, chayav, chutz min hachatat sheshachato shelo lishma. If you remember, I'll keep repeating these laws because eventually you'll get them, which is the only two that can't be valid when it's all sacrifices. When you do them shelo lishmo, they're not done properly, but many of them you can sacrifice anyway. Okay, and that's all sacrifices that are done, whether lishma, whether they're lo lishma, they're valid. You just have to kind of fix, like, let's say you promised you would bring an ola and you did it as a shlamim, it's a problem and you have to bring a new one, but the sacrifice can still be sacrificed on the altar. You can still sprinkle the blood, all that. But just the chatat and the Pesach that you do shelo lishmo are invalid offerings. So therefore, once it's an invalid offering, there's no prohibition. If it's a valid offering, even though you didn't do it the way you were supposed to do it, and you still have to replace the one you were supposed to, but it's still a valid offering, can be offered, and therefore, if you have chametz at home, it's a problem. So let's try to understand Rabbi Shimon. My time at Rabbi Shimon. As I mentioned, this verse appears twice. So because it says zivchi in one verse and it says zivchi in another verse, we make a drasha on the double. So now we say, kare be zevach zvachai. Okay, we read it one as zevach, one as zvachai. Zivchi is singular, but it could also be read as zivchei, as many. So it could be read as singular and it could be read as plural. So what does he say? One time, because the question is always, why does this pasuk repeat? Right? So they have their own answers to why it repeats. Say it's to teach you, according to Rabbi Shimon, zevach zvachai. Why did it separate these and write one, right? Write them both, and one is referring to one and one is referring to many. Lemeimar, to teach you. When there's one sacrifice, which is on your dalit in the afternoon, you have one sacrifice to bring. It's true, you also have the tamid, but they're saying there's really one main sacrifice of that afternoon. Then we say zivchi, singular, it's just that one. When you don't have that one special one to bring, then we say all of them. Okay, and that's why during the week, it includes everything. Ubamoed lishmo patur. Okay, this is a good example where they quote a line of the Mishnah and they say, Bamoed lishmo patur vichule. That means etc., right? And whatever else appears there. But they're going to really deal with not those three words that they quoted. This happens very often, but the vichu, okay, the continuation. So again, what did it say there? If you did it on the moed, on the rest of the holiday, for the sake of Pesach, it's an invalid offering, therefore you're exempt from this prohibition. But if you did it shelo lishmo, if you did it for the purpose of a shlamim, then you're going to be obligated for lo tishchat because that's a valid korban. Now they're going to derive something or infer something, I should say, from here. Notice what they said. They didn't say lishmo and stam meaning you didn't specify anything. They said shelo lishmo. You would have to say, I'm sacrificing this for the sake of a shlam. So it sounds like, what if you just didn't say anything and you took your korban Pesach, you designated it as korban Pesach, you took that animal, it's now, Pesach is, past, you're already at, let's say, the 17th, like I said before. 17th of the month, could be any day of Pesach, you slaughter that animal without saying what you're slaughtering it for. Now, what did we learn before? If you do that, as soon as Pesach passes, if you remember, I mentioned this in passing, once the day for slaughtering the korban Pesach passes, your korban automatically defaults into a shlamim. So that doesn't seem to match what it says here, and that's what they're going to question. So, okay, Gita, I see your question. Does it mean it requires verbalization? So again, it's always a debate here, and this is a debate throughout. Whenever we talk about machshava, it could mean thinking in your head, or it could mean explicitly stating. I might say it's saying, but it doesn't necessarily mean only saying. Depends on where you side on that machloket. Could just mean thinking. Did you think nothing, or did you think I'm doing this for a shlamim? Okay, that's the difference. It could be thinking, or it could be expressing. Could be both. Okay, there's two tracks, and we don't know the right answer. Okay, so now they say, so Tama, again, they're not darshaning the words lishmo patur, shelo lishmo chayav. So they say, Tama de shelo lishmo, hastama patur. We can infer from here, only if you have the intent of shelo lishmo. But if you just had no intent whatsoever, and you just brought that animal and sacrificed it without any intent of what you were sacrificing, sounds like you'd be exempt from lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Amai. Why would that be? Based on what we know, Pesach b'shar yemot hashana shlamim have. Right, a Pesach on any other day of the year is automatically a shlamim, meaning once we pass Pesach and the date is behind us, which obviously in this case it is, it automatically reverts to a shlamim. So Shema Mina, Pesach b'shar yemot hashana baya. Kira, are you trying to say, is this Mishnah saying that you actually need to uproot it from the name of Pesach to bring it as a shlamim? And which would mean you'd have to designate it specifically as a shlamim, again, either in your head or in words. So I'm Rabbi Chia bar Gamda, nizreka mipi chavura. Here's a bit of a joke, I think, right? It was thrown out from the group. What he meant was, right, I was sitting with a bunch of Talmidei Chachamim and someone threw out this answer, but he's obviously making this reference to chavura and the group, right? We keep talking about the group of people that have to be registered for the Korban Pesach. נזרקה מפי החבורה ואמרו, כגון שהיו בעלים טמאי מת ונדחים לפסח שני. דסתמי לשום פסח חי. There's one exception to that rule, which is, yes, your Pesach automatically reverts to a shlamim unless you're one of those people who couldn't bring the Korban Pesach because you were impure, you had become impure to a dead person, or because you were too far away and couldn't make it. Those are excuses why you don't have to bring Pesach Rishon, and you can bring it on the second Pesach a month later. So now you're in the middle of the holiday and you designated the animal. The animal is still designated for Pesach unless you say, I'm doing a Shalom Lishma. And then it would be a Shlamim. So they're saying that the inference from the Mishnah would only be if you still needed that animal for your Korban Pesach because you didn't yet sacrifice your Korban Pesach. Okay, again, to say the Mishnah is only that case would be a little strange, but that's how they answer questions. Okay, now we get to the new section, which is the rest of the Mishnayot of this chapter, which are very interesting, and they're going to describe what happened in the temple during the days, right? The question that's been bothering all of us is, how did it work? What did it look like, right? We really want to visualize what happened in the temple. And this Mishnah, this set of Mishnayot are going to try to give us a view into what things were like. I'll kind of tell you from Safrai's introduction to this chapter. He does a beautiful job. If you have the book Mishnah Eretz Yisrael, there's also an article. I haven't looked at the article. I was reading more over Shabbat from his book Mishnah Eretz Yisrael, but there's also an article he wrote about the Korban Pesach. It's in Hebrew, the Korban Pesach be made by a Sheni in the time of the Second Temple that you can find. I think it's on the Da'at. I sent it to someone who had asked me, so we can pass it around. Anyway, it's an interesting article. If anyone wants, you can ask me. I'll send you the link but you can look up Safrai and Pesach by Cheni, and I'm sure you'll find it online. And he basically talks about the idea of what's going on here, that this is a type of Mishnah. We know there's different types of Mishnayot. We've seen a lot already now. We see there's different styles. These are the types of Mishnayot that describe what happened actually in the temple. And there's all sets of Mishnayot that are like that. And where, like in Yomi, for example, where it talks about the Avodah of the Kohen Gadol. And what he says in a very beautiful way, he says that there's a mix of a bunch of things going on here. This is, I think, a good background before we start learning it, which is there's a mix of halacha, there's a mix of tradition, there's a mix of nostalgia. You know, the way they were remembering how it was then. Think about, they were living very soon after the destruction, and they missed what was then, and some of them lived through it, some of them didn't live through it, some of them may have never even been there. You know, they might have been on the outside, they maybe never saw it firsthand, right? Often you have the people who are from the Kohanim families who are telling us what's going on inside. And he says it very beautifully. He says there's a mix of like love, you know, and thirst for it, and also a bit of sadness that they're not there anymore, that they don't have it anymore. It's a very beautiful description and to kind of think about when we're about to read this. So, and there's a lot of exaggeration also, I should add. Okay, we're going to see. I guess that's the nostalgia part. When we're nostalgic about something, we often exaggerate. And you'll see that throughout some of the things we're going to see today. Okay, nobody really knows. I'll just put it out there because people have asked me this question. Nobody really knows. Did everybody come in Aliyah L'Regel? Did they not all come in Aliyah L'Regel? In fact, Safrai says very interestingly that the sects, right, there were these other sects around, and some of them, right, the Stukim were the main ones in the temple, who were the Kohanim. They didn't really believe so much in Aliyah L'Regel, and that's because they were crazy about purity and impurity issues, and they didn't want the average Joe Schmo coming into the temple. That was like a breach in their, they were very strict, you know, purity people, and they didn't want anyone else coming into their temple. And that they didn't like this whole idea of everybody coming to the temple. They don't really talk about Aliyah L'Regel, whereas our texts are all very Prushi, right? The Prushim, they were the ones who were really very into having everybody come be involved, having involvement of the people in the sacrifices. And the Korban Pesach was a perfect example for this, because even though, and we'll talk about this later, but even though the Shechita could always be done by a non-Kohen, generally it was really done by the Kohanim, because everything really was handled by the Kohen. Okay, but when it came to the Korban Pesach, that was the one time a year that really the people came and they slaughtered their own sacrifices. Again, not everybody came and slaughtered because it was one representative from the group, but still the people themselves slaughtered it, and then they handed off to the Kohen to do the other avodot, which they couldn't themselves do. But they actually come into the Azara, they come into the area right before where the altar is, and they do the slaughtering themselves, and we'll see the whole description. HaPesach nishchap b'shalosh kitot. They would have three groups, okay? Three right? You would bring in one group, then the next group, then the next group. Okay, that's how we would split it up. What's interesting is they don't tell you how you can imagine total pandemonium, right? You think about the distribution of the vaccine right now, right? You can totally imagine it, total pandemonium. They don't give you any rules. And this is good, right? In Israel, there's a lot more rules about it. And in many places in the world, they don't really have good rules. And you see what pandemonium it's caused. So there's no rules about who gets in first, who gets in second, who gets in third, okay? But they say now that the Pesach nishcha b'shalosh kitot, okay, in 3 groups. Shene'emal, where do we get this from? Again, this is always classic. We take something that existed and then we try to connect it to a verse. Right? It's usually, in this case, it seems like that's the direction. V'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael. It says they slaughtered it, the whole community of the group of Jews. Okay, so kahal ve'edav Yisrael. There's 3 sections talked about here, and each one, right, classic. Right, we'll get to this later, but classic, these words usually mean a minyan, 10 people. So we'll get to that later in the Gemara. But you see there's 3 groups of people. So the first group comes in, they fill up the azara. Okay, this is like when you're online for the airport, right? They let a bunch of people in and then they cut the line and say, okay, you have to wait. Okay, so that's what they would do. They would let everyone in. Na'alu daltot azara. Okay, they'd lock the doors of the azara. You can imagine, because everyone's trying to get in, right? You're the first person on that line. You're like, no, really? Like I missed my chance to get in. And you can imagine the people are dying to get in. So they close the door, they lock the doors. We're going to see later, did they lock them? Did they lock in some miraculous way? We'll get to that. Tak'u hariyu v'tak'u. So now they blow the shofar. They blow the tkiya, then the trua, then the tkiya. Okay, that, by the way, is something not unique to the Korban Pesach. All the sacrifices were brought with trumpets blowing. This is very interesting, by the way, because we're going to have, it's trumpets, right? I don't believe it's the shofar. I think it's the trumpets. Anyway, what's interesting here, I want you to hear, like you can, when you talk, you hear the voices, right? Imagine the sheep, they're all making noises and there's people and tons of people. And then there's the blowing of the trumpets. And then the Kohanim omdim shurot shurot. The Kohanim are standing in rows. Okay, there's a nice picture in the Koren. Okay, if you have it, there's 2 rows of Kohanim standing, and in between them are all these regular people with their animals. They're all slaughtering. Everyone has a Kohen next to him. And there's 2 shurot, so each one has bezichei kesef u'bezichei zahav. Each one has, it's like a bezich is a we'll get to the Levim. There's a stick, okay, like I'm losing my words, a handle with like a big spoon, okay, it's maybe more like a bowl, okay, hanging from this handle. And there were ones made of silver and ones made of gold, and it's to hold the blood when it comes out of the animal. Shura shekula kesef kesef, shura shekula zahav zahav. There's 1 row of all the gold ones and 1 row of the Kohanim holding all the silver ones. So if you had silver, you went in that line. You had gold, you went in that line. Lo hayu mu'ravin, and they wouldn't mix. Okay, we're going to get in the Gemara to all the details of why we do it like this. Lo hayu lebezichim shulaim. Okay, they weren't flat at the bottom. You would think maybe a bowl would be flat at the bottom. You could put it down. No, they didn't want them to put it down. Shamiyin chevi kashadam. They didn't want the blood to congeal, so they wanted them to keep holding it so it wouldn't congeal. Shachat Yisrael v'kibel kohen. Okay, so now the Yisrael would slaughter. Again, now the Gemara is going to say it's just to teach you that Yisrael potentially can. But here again, the Mishnah is describing what would happen. Generally, the Yisrael would be the one slaughtering. Kibel kohen, the kohen has to do the work from there on. Noten lechavero v'chavero lechavero. Now, imagine the room is full of people. So if each kohen walked to the altar to bring the blood, it would be a balagan. There would be nowhere to walk. So they would basically pass the bowls from one to the other, like an assembly line. Right? Each one would get a full one and then return the empty one. When it gets to the one that's standing near the altar, he would throw it on the part of the altar. There were 2 sides of the altar that had a base at the bottom called the yesod that jutted out. It would be there. And there was a hole and the blood would go down. Okay, I saw, Joanna, you wrote about people wearing white and sprinkled in blood. So first of all, when I went to the Zevach HaShomroni, okay, something that is a worthwhile thing to see, although it's not so easy to watch, but the Shomronim actually do a Korban Pesach still, and sometimes it comes out on the 14th of Iyar, so it's not Erev Pesach, and you can go, and I saw it once I was in Bar Ilan University, and they took us on a trip. It was amazing. And you could really visualize it. And they're all wearing white and they're splattered with blood. I mean, you see like red all over their clothes. It's so interesting to see. Anyway, Right. One of the interesting things is you saw the kids playing with the sheep in the beginning, and then they slaughter them. The whole thing was a little difficult to watch, but very interesting. Then what happens? So yatzta kat rishona v'nichnesa kat shniya. So then they're finished, and then they now do the next group. Yatzta shniya nichnesa shlishit. Okay, so then the second group comes in, the third goes out, the third one comes in. K'maseh rishona kach maseh shniya v'shlishit. Right, so every group is the same thing. Kavu et hallel. Here come the Leviim. Okay, the Leviim were singing hallel, although I think I saw somewhere maybe even Kohanim. But in any case, some Tosfot says it's the Leviim. They would recite hallel while this all was going on. So again, you get back to the sounds. You hear the hallel being sung the whole time. Im gamru shanu, im shanu shileshu. If they finished all of hallel, they would do it again. They would do it a second time and then a third time. Okay, the basic point is they would never need a third time, really, more than a third time, because they were very quick. They even say, theoretically, you could do it 3 times, but it never happened. Okay, again, this is like description of the nostalgia, like it would never be. They were always so quick. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, by the third one, they wouldn't even get to the middle paragraph of Ahavti ki yishma Hashem, because there weren't that many people left. And that is the point, was everyone got in either the first or the second. Whoever was in the third were just like the leftovers, and there weren't a lot of people. Okay, because there were few left at that point. Everything was done the same on Shabbat, other than we'll see, okay, a few minor things. The Kohanim wanted to clean the floor of the temple because it was full of blood, right? Okay, they were like they even described once they were up to their knees in blood, and they wanted to clean it, and the Chachamim weren't happy with this. This, by the way, shows again the tension between the Kohanim, who were often the Tzdukim and some of the other sects, versus the Prushim, and they had different traditions. The rabbinic tradition was no washing the floors. But interestingly, what happened was, since this was the temple, the Kohanim went out and they just did it anyway. Okay, very interesting in terms of the tensions, right? There's a lot of things underlying this Mishnah that aren't stated explicitly, but are clearly under the surface here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kos hayam emalei midam ha'ta'arovet, tzrakos zrika achat al gabei hamizbeach v'lehodu lo chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says this, what the rabbis don't agree with, that you would take a cup, the Kohanim would fill up a cup from all the blood that was in the floor, okay? There was still kind of, they had a drain, like a plug to the drain. There was a drain where all the blood would drip out, but they would leave it in for this reason, according to Rabbi Yehuda, because they were worried that maybe some of the blood spilled on the way and that someone's korban didn't get sprinkled. So what they did was they would put a cup down. Now what happens with liquids is everything gets mixed in. So if you scoop up a cup full of blood from the floor, you can assume it has a mixture of all the different sacrifices, and they would sprinkle that just in case. Okay, we'll see this in the Gemara exactly why they did this, and the rabbis didn't agree with this approach, and we'll see why. Not today. Ketzad tolinu mafshitim. The next thing you have to do is take off the hide of the animal, and that's because they had to open up to get to the inside. Remember, they roasted it whole, but they had to take out the parts that have to be burned on the altar. Some of the fats, right, and some of the inner parts, like the kidneys. So what would they do? Okay, there were these metal things like hooks that would come out of the wall, and there were these pillars. Okay, this was all in the Beit Mikbachayim area. This is in the northern side. Okay, I want to just point out. We'll get to this in Zvachim, but you normally do the slaughtering on the northern side of the temple. All the Kodesh Kodeshim you can only slaughter on the northern side. This is Kodeshim Kalim, so you could slaughter it anywhere. It didn't have to be on the northern side of the Azara. So they had the whole area. Now remember, the non-Kohanim can't pass by the Azara. So there's this one narrow area where everyone was standing. And therefore they could also spread out to the southern side. So it was much easier. They had the whole space. It was wide. It was just narrow. Not deep. You didn't go very far in, but it was a wide space, the whole width of the area. And then there they have, both in the Beit Mikbachayim, there were these pillars, and on the walls around, they had these hooks coming out. Shabahen tolinu mafshitim. They would use that for flaying the hide. If there wasn't space, here you see that they didn't always have space for everyone because there were a lot of people here. What would they do? They would take maklot dakim v'chalakim ayusham. They had a whole bunch of these sticks that were there. And we would take 2 people. We would put a pole from my shoulder to your shoulder. We would hang the animal in between. They would rest on our shoulders. and some third person would come and take out the inner parts, right? He would take off the skin and find the inner parts. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, wait, but there's an exception on Shabbat. On Shabbat, there was a problem. Shechali op Shabbat. Yudal Shechali op Shabbat. When the 14th comes out on Shabbat, Meniach yado al ketef chavero v'yad chavero al tefo v'tole umafshit. Okay, so what would they do in this case? They would take, just one second. Yeah, this appears in Shabbat Gita on Kuf Kaf Gimel. Okay, whenever you have that question, did this appear somewhere else? You can always look in the Masorah Hashas and they tell you where it appears. So yes, we have this on Shabbat. What would you do? You would put your hand, right, on your friend's shoulder and your arms. I was thinking of these army guys that, have done a lot of, their arms are very strong. You would need someone like that. And you would hold your arms out, put the animal on your arms, use your arms as sticks basically, and you would hang it there. And that's, some people say it's muktzah issues, some people say it's other issues. We're not going to get into it just yet. So they would tear it and take out the inner parts. They would put it in a big bowl, and then they would burn them. They would bring it to the altar and burn them on the altar. Now, what happens when everyone's finished, right? Would you rather be in the first group? It's like getting on the airplane. Do you like to be the first online and get in the airplane and then you just wait around there, or wait outside, right? So would you rather be, seems here everybody really wanted to be in the first group, but theoretically you might say, oh, well, then you just have to sit waiting around. If you go in the first group, you have to wait till the second group finishes and the third group. So so they would go out and they would sit in the Har HaBayit area on the Temple Mount, because you can't sit near the Azara. So they would basically go out and wait. Shnia Bachel, this was this area that went around the temple area. So they would wait there. Okay, and the third one would stay where they are. Now, this is only on Shabbat, because otherwise they would take their animals home. But here you can't take the animals home because it's Shabbat, you can't carry. So Chashecha, they would wait till it got dark, and then they would all go home. So if it was a regular day, you wouldn't have to worry about being first, you wouldn't have to wait. If you were first on Shabbat, you'd have to wait around for a while. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. So the Gemara starts off and says, it would be 30 in a group. Now you're going to see that this is going to contradict what we're going to see later, that there were 600,000, or actually 1,200,000 in doing this entirely. So again, these sources, it's very hard to figure out exactly how many people there were, but he says, theoretically, it should be 30 in each group. My time, where do we get to this 30? Kahal ve'edav Yisrael. Okay, it's because it says Kahal Adan Yisrael, which we said means three groups, but now he's going to say it's not so clear what it means. Does it mean at all times you need all three, meaning 30 altogether, because each one represents 10? Or do they come 10, 10, 10? So if you do three groups of 30 each, then you resolve all issues. You have 30 at a time, and you also have at least 10 in each group, because it never means only 10, right? Just like a minyan, you can always have more than 10. Of course, not if you're worried about corona restrictions, but basically, theoretically, you could have more, and therefore it's fine. Therefore, he says, Hilkach b'chamishim nami sagya, but then you can also theoretically, it can work for 50 people. Why? To aylin taltim ba'avde, aylin asara v'nafke asara, ayle asara v'nafke asara. How do you do it if you don't have 60, if you don't have 90, basically, right? Because 30, 30, 30 would be 90. So what would you do to be Yotze, having 30 at a time and also 30, and also three different groups? So you'd start off with your 30, 10 would leave, and when the second group comes in, 20 stay, even though they've already done what they need to do. They stay in there, then 10 leave, and then a new 10 come in. And that way you cover your 50, but you also cover making sure you have 30 at every given point. Nichnisa kat rishona. So now we said the doors get locked. Itma. Abai Amar, Itmar always means intro to debate between Amoraim. Abai Amar nin alutnan. Rava Amar no alimtnan. There's a debate about what the actual word in the Mishnah is. And in fact, some texts, if you the manuscript, some say no alim and some say nin alim. So nin alu means they got locked by themselves. No alim means they lock them actively. So my benayu, ika benayu lemismachanisa. Do we rely on miracles? Okay, this is a theme that comes up, not so often. But once in a while in the temple, there's some things that they talk about that were miraculous. So this is one of those sources. You keep letting people in and you wait till miraculously that door locks. That's your sign that this is enough people. Okay, you don't have to monitor the crowd. Basically, it happens by miracle. Rava Amar no alim t'nam, but lo samchinan anisa. You don't wait for a miracle. You stand, there's a guard at the door who decides, okay, we got too many people in the temple right now, closing those doors, right? You think about all the claustrophobic people, how they managed in the temple. V'haditznan. The fact that it says in the Mishnah, now we're basically going to bring this total other issue, which has nothing to do with our issue, and I'm not going to even get into the story, but there was a story about a Kavi ben Mahalalel, and some people say he was excommunicated. So this Mishnah says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda chas v'shalom shakavi ben Mahalalel nitnada. There's no way he was put in excommunication, because it's known she'ein azara nin'elet al kol adam b'Yisrael b'chokhmah b'yirat chet kakavi ben Mahalalel. Because it's one of those things that people say, that the azara walls were never closed, were never locked, with anybody in them who was greater than in intelligence and in fear of sin, like a Kavi ben Mahalel. I mean, he was such a great person. There's no way that he was put into excommunication. So now, notice they use this phrase that people talk about. The walls of the Azara were never locked for someone, right? With someone like him inside. So Abaye mitaretz the tameh, but Rava mitaretz the tameh. Each of them explains this according to their interpretation. Abaye mitaretz the tameh ein ba'azara b'sha'ah sheninala al kol adam Yisrael b'chokhmah v'yirat chet ka'kavi ben Mahalalel. He says there was no one in the Azara when they physically locked the doors. And I'm sorry, I said it wrong. That's Rava. And did I read wrong? Did I skip Abaye? Abaye says ein ba'azara b'sha'ah sheninala, that it was locked to Kol Yisrael. And Rava mitaretz the tameh ein ba'azara b'sha'ah sheno alimota. Okay, so Abaye will say when it said locked, it meant that locked automatically, and Rava reads it as they locked it themselves. Okay, now come the two, I think they're kind of funny stories, and there's a little bit of a play going on here. Tanu Rabbanit, me'olam lo nitma'eh adam b'azara. Here's the nostalgia, right? No matter how many people were there, believe it or not, no one was ever trampled, right? You think about Mecca and all that, right? No one was ever trampled. Chutz mi Pesach echad, except for one time, shaya b'yimei Hillel. It was in the time of Hillel, and one elderly person got crushed. And they called that Pesach the crushed Passover. Tanu Rabbanan, another source, and this is I'm continuing because this is a play. This is called Pesach Meuchim. The next one is going to be called Pesach Me'ubin. Aveh means thick, okay? It means great. So great in numbers. Pamachat Bikesh Agrippas HaMelech, and here's real exaggeration. Agrippas HaMelech wanted Litene Nabuch L'Sei Yisrael. He wanted to count the people, like do a census. Amar le Kohen Gadol Tene Necha B'Pesachim. He said, "What's the best way to do a census? All the people are here now. Let's take count with the Pesachim." Natal Kuliach Mikol Echad. He took a kidney from each sacrifice. V'nimtzeu sham shishim ribo zukei klayot. When he collected all the kidneys from all the sacrifices, they ended up with 600,000 pairs of kidneys. That means there were 1,200,000 animals. That's just animals. Kiflaim kiyotzei Mitzrayim. There's obviously, right, they're using the words, the numbers that we say that 600,000 people left Egypt. So it's double that number of just sacrifices. Who's not included in this? This doesn't even include the people who couldn't bring the sacrifice that year. And every sacrifice was for 10 different people. Pesach Me'ubin, and they called this the Pesach Me'ubin. Look how many people there were. Okay, clear exaggeration here, but anyway, it's again nostalgia. How great it was then. How many people came? Natal Kuliya. Now wait, they asked, just like Becky just asked me. What do you mean? Don't they have to burn the kidneys? Habaya Ktura. Don't they have to burn them? So they say the Hadar Maktilu. No, they took them and then they brought them back and they burnt them. Bakti Viktiro. But how could you then just burn them all together? You have to do each one separately. It says, they burnt it singular. No, they would then burn it one at a time. But wait, it says Viktiram in a different verse. It says, and they burned them. That means you have to burn all the parts from each sacrifice. So if you separate each kidney, it's no longer connected with the other parts of that animal that have to be burned. He would take one of the kidneys from each one, but he didn't take it. He just held it for a moment. And he would he would hold it till they gave him something else. They would say, "Oh, I'll give you this in place of our kidney." And then he took whatever he collected from everybody and he counted those. My time. Why they stay in lines, only the silver, only the gold? The first thinking is, and this is again classic, we're worried about people tricking and using, trying to steal from the temple. Maybe someone will pull out a silver one from his pocket and switch it with the gold one, stick the gold one in his pocket. Maybe he'll take a gold one that's worth 200 and switch it with a gold one that's worth 100. It doesn't help that they separate the silver and the gold. It just looks nicer. Okay. And again, this is the idea of the looks of the temple, that everything be perfect. They didn't have flat bottoms. Tanu Rabbanan. What's the problem? The breads. Okay, remember the showbreads had these bowls with frankincense in them. So those had a bottom because if they tilted and leaned on the bread was matzah-like bread and it would break. So that's why that one had a bottom, but nothing else did. Shachat Yisrael v'kibel kohen. Lo sagya delav Yisraeli, right? It has to be a Yisrael. So they say, no, he gufa kamashman the shchita b'zar kshira. It doesn't have to be Yisrael, but it's to teach you that the shchita could have been done by Yisrael. And also, as I described it, the way Safrai describes it, right? The idea is that the Israelim were the ones actually doing it. It's descriptive. It's not necessarily trying to teach you it has to be a Yisrael. V'kibel kohen hakamash malami kabbalah ve'elach mitzvah kuna. From here you learn Kabbalah and on, only the Kohen can do it. They say, wait a minute, there's a whole debate, I believe it's in Zvachim. One, if you learn, you remember that we learned this already, that if you learned the last cycle, which is, holacha means carrying the blood to the altar. Can you do it without moving your feet? Can you just pass it to someone? So it sounds like from here you could, because they just passed it. So they say, Dilmahu denayib porta. Maybe each one moved a step, okay? And each one moved a step and then passed it. Elamai kamashmalan. So then what's it teaching us? Hakamashmalan berov am hadrat melech. Oh, it's to teach you that it's best to have the most people possible involved in the mitzvah, which is really what you're seeing in general here, right? We had so many people involved in what's going on. Kibela tamaleu machzira tarikan. So he would first accept the full one and then he would return the empty one. Why in that order? Aval ibchalo, not the opposite. If you have the option to do a mitzvah, do that first. So the empty one is not for the mitzvah. The full one is to sprinkle the blood. Kohen karov etzel hamizbeach, he throws the blood onto the altar. Mantana Pesach bizrika. How do you know Pesach has to be thrown? Now, this is a good thing. This is something that comes up in general with sacrifices. We'll see this here. And also, it comes up mainly in Zvachim, which is that many sacrifices, it doesn't give you, it looks very detailed by Yikra, but it happens to be that it doesn't tell you a lot of the details of what you do in each korban. And lots of times they learn one from the other. Okay, so here's a good example where it doesn't say there's different ways. You can sprinkle the blood, you can throw the blood, you can pour the blood. It doesn't say what you're supposed to do with the blood on Pesach. So they say here, how do we know the Pesach is bizrika, and who does this Mishnah hold by that says you actually throw it rather than pour? So Amar of Chisda, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, he detanya Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, et damam tizrok al mizbeach, et chabam taktir. This is about the bechor, the firstborn animal that you slaughter. Damo lo ne'emar ela damam. It doesn't say its blood; it says their blood. So they assume. Yossi Aglili says, and chabono lo ne'emar ela chalbam, plural. Limeid al bechor u'maseru pesach sheim tunim matan damim b'imurim legabei mizbeach. So they say just like by there, you need to throw the blood. Also here, you throw the blood. Minal and detunim yisod. How do you know it needs to be done by the base of the altar? Amar, right, there's two sides where it has something jutting out at the bottom, the yisod. Amar Rabbi Elazar, at yazrika zrika me'olah. They learn zrika from bechor from zrika on the olah, and since we already learned the zrika from bechor to Pesach, it'll be also relevant there. Ktiv hacha etamam tizrok al mizbeach, uktiv hatam v'zarku b'nei Aaron hakohanim etamol al mizbeach saviv. Notice it says around, so we'll get to that soon. Ma olah tuna yisod. Of Pesach to Yisod, because it says there they would Lizrok al Mizbeach, and it says there Yizrok al Mizbeach. The same way they do it by the Ola, by the Yisod, also here it has to be done by the Yisod. Tomorrow we'll start with how do you know that the Ola was done by the Yisod? Okay, and that's where we'll learn that tomorrow. So that's it for today. I started getting in onto how all this worked, and we'll deal with more of the details tomorrow. Shavua tov, everybody.